everyone. It's so good to have you here. Thank you for joining us for daily devotions through Redeeming Life. And if we haven't met before, I'm Dan. I'm a teaching pastor here at Redeeming Life, and with Jesse Eisenhower, El Padre. Love that man. If you haven't, when you get a chance, give him a hug and tell him you love him. He's a great guy. But I digress. Thank you for joining us for daily devotions, where we come together and study God's Word together and learn and grow in our living relationship with God. So today's a special day, actually. Today is Saturday, May 1st, and finally, we've been following through the Revive School reading plan, been following through the wisdom literature of the Bible. That's Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. How much fun that was. It was great, but it was really long. And today we actually make a giant leap out of the wisdom corpus into what's known the Pauline epistles, the Pauline corpus. So we're making this giant leap from the Old Testament into the New Testament. And we're going to be spending, let's see here, today's May 1st, all the way through July 26th, going through Paul's letters to the churches, the believers who are spread throughout the known world. Paul and his writings make up a significant portion of the entire New Testament. And Paul, as you may know, as we hear about his story as it's told in the book of Acts, that he was originally called Saul, and he was a Pharisee of Pharisees who persecuted Christians. But then after this radical confrontation, this meeting, this vision that where Christ confronts him on the road to Damascus, his life changes dramatically, and he comes to be not only a disciple of Christ, but an apostle, a person who's sent to throughout the known world, preaching the gospel and sharing the good news of what Christ has done to bring about salvation, not just for the Jews, but for everybody. And what we have in the New Testament are letters that Paul writes to the churches, whether they're in Ephesus or Colossae, or in this case, what we'll be talking about, a letter to the church in Rome. And what I wanted to do was pause just for a moment and make a few observations about the epistles of the New Testament in general, specifically the Pauline ones. A Pauline epistle is a letter that's written by the Apostle Paul. And one of the things that's helped me when I'm reading through the epistles is to remember a point made by Ben Witherington, and he makes the observation that an epistle is what you might call an oral text. Now, an oral text, yes, that does sound like a paradox, a contradiction in terms, but what we mean by an oral text is that it's a surrogate for the apostles' actual presence in another church. So when you read Acts, you realize that Paul goes on several missionary journeys, and he's constantly moving wherever it is that God opens a door for him to go. And so he goes, he plants a church, he establishes it, and then moves on to the next place as the Lord creates opportunities for him to go and share the gospel to places where the gospel has never gone. And so he keeps going back, or keeps going on these missionary circuits, as it were. And then when he gets to a new place, he knows that he still has a need to minister to the churches that he's already planted, or another apostle has already planted. He wants to pour into the lives of these Christians of whom he can't be there physically, can't be physically present in a way that he wants to be. So the next best option, if he can't be there physically present, he'll write them a letter. To that extent, when we talk about these letters, what's happening is not just simply Paul sitting down and reflecting and thinking about how much he misses the church in Thessalonica and saying, so I'll sit down and write a letter and say, oh, how are you? I'm doing fine. It's great to see you. I hope all things well on your side of things, and see you later. Bye, kind of thing. That's not the way in which we want to be thinking about the letters of Paul. But in the first place, they are occasional in nature. There's some sort of need that Paul is trying to address when he's writing to the churches. It's important for us to remember that when Paul is sitting down to write an epistle, he's not primarily writing it as a theologian, as someone who is, in this high, lofty chair, or as a person who is some sort of professor locked away in this musty old study who's thinking about theology and thinking, I think I'll write to the Romans about justification by faith. I think that would be helpful to them. He's not writing with that type of attitude, from that type of approach. He's not even really as much writing in terms of as a prophet, as someone who is even though he is writing and speaking the words of God to the people in these churches, but his approach to writing isn't especially prophetic. And it's not even, as I think some of us might like to think, that he is writing with the hopes that he's adding more books to the Bible, even though that's so, even though his letters bear an authoritative witness as the Word of God in the New Testament canon. Paul is really writing primarily as a pastor, as a person who loves the people within these churches and the people that they have to meet and work with every single day. And he cares about them deeply. And as we'll be reading through Romans, we'll see just how deep and how much of his heart goes out to the people that he's writing to. And that he's writing because he cares. He's writing so that the people who are reading their letters can have a really clear picture, a demonstration, a way forward towards how the people of God should relate their faith to their works, their orthopraxy, their orthodoxy, that's right belief, to orthopraxy, to right behaviors. Romans is certainly no exception to that. Paul desires for these churches the same sort of thing that we should desire, that is, to be attentive to the word of the Lord, so that our lives as Christ followers, as his disciples, as people who belong to God by virtue of the message of the gospel, that our lives would be fruitful, that God's purposes would be made manifest in their lives as much as they would be in our lives. So I want to be able to hear the word of the Lord through someone like Pastor Paul, who's writing, these epistles, which are really written sermons that address sometimes very specific issues, sometimes very general issues, but they're whole sermons. And it's for that reason, if you have the opportunity, we know that through the Arrive School reading plan, the books are segmented as one chapter a day. But if you have the opportunity, by all means, read it all in one sitting, because when these letters are delivered, and you can imagine a whole congregation, gathering together in this, large room, this home where they're gathering together and worshiping God, that there's one person who's reading aloud the whole epistle to everybody who's within an earshot. And they would read introduction, body, and conclusion, the whole thing from beginning to end, so that it's clear in their minds and what they're hearing that they're not just listening to the little bits of what Paul is trying to say, but listening to everything of what Paul is trying to say, and listening his train of argument that begins at the beginning and follows along through the middle and comes up to a practical conclusion at the very end. And it's difficult to read, especially long books like Romans or 1 Corinthians in one sitting, but if you can, please do so. It will help you with grasping, will help you with your retention of the entire book, and help instruct us in asking the right questions along the way. So, but the last thing about Pauline epistles, whichever epistle that you're writing, remember that these are occasional. There's a reason that Paul is sitting down to write. Keep your eyes and your ears open to spot out at least the answers to two specific questions. That is, what is the problem and what is the solution? What is the plight that's facing the recipients of this letter, whether that's a whole congregation or certain individuals? And then what's the solution? In what way does the message of the gospel and God's word address this particular issue at hand? In any of the epistles, from Romans to Philemon, or Philemon as it's sometimes pronounced, pause long enough to ask those questions. But thank you so much for listening about Pauline epistles in general. And we're going to jump in today. Our reading portion is for Romans chapter 1. Romans is the longest of Paul's letters. And for that reason, it is one that has been understood as one of his most theologically deep, even though I think that that's shortchanging the rest of the Pauline epistles that are also very deep. But one of the difficulties with reading Romans is that it is indeed his longest epistle, and as its longest epistle, it's sometimes difficult to be able to follow his train of thought. When Paul is sitting down to address an issue, say in chapters 9 through 11, he's assuming that you've been following his argument from the very beginning. And that's one of the things that make it very difficult. But what I would like for you to do, or what I would like to help piece together the whole of Romans by giving you a theme to follow, and how that theme is addressed or unpacked in larger sections. Now, scholars will debate ad nauseum about Romans as far as what is its central theme. Martin Luther famously recognized that the central theme of Romans is justification by faith. And there's a lot of truth to what he argues. Philip Melanchthon would later on just call all of Romans a compendium of Christian orthodoxy and doctrine, that if you could just read and grasp Romans, you would really get the essential bearings on Christian belief and what it means to be a follower of Christ. And there's some truth to that as well. But what I would like to offer to you as a proposed central theme about Romans is the gospel. And I want you to look at Romans chapter 1, verses 16 through 17. And it says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Those two verses are what you might call a thesis statement, a proposition that's front-loaded at the epistle that recognizes Paul's firm position, summarized and succinct, compact, that can be just put together in a single breath. Now, that thesis statement is what he spends the rest of the book from chapter 1, verse 18, essentially through the end of chapter 15, where he seeks to defend that thesis statement. It's like you have this thing holding it in your hands that's called the gospel. And it's a gospel that's pretty simple, that like according to what Jesse has pointed out in the Revive School reading plan and the what's follows along what you might call the Romans Road, is very simple. It's so simple that a child of 5 can grasp it on some level, but it can confound the wisdom of the wisest throughout the rest of their life, because it's that deep. Paul is writing to say, yes, this gospel in the one sense is very, very simple. It's very succinct. It's very compact. But I want to unpack it. I want to demonstrate the internal logic about what the gospel is, why it makes sense, and why it matters for everybody, so that what it has to say is important, not just for Jews, not just for Gentiles, but for Jews and Gentiles, for those who are who belong in a fellowship of believers, and who are on the outside, who have yet to come to follow Christ and to place their faith and trust in him. You might want to say, or to jot this question at the very beginning, just ask, what is the gospel? And to keep that question in the back of your mind, and to watch how Paul, in such expansive and profound detail, unpacks what the gospel is. The glory of something like this is that the gospel has oftentimes been said that it's simple enough that an infant can wade in it, as if it were on like the shoreline, where you can just get in and touch it and feel it and say, wow, this is really the ocean. But it also goes deep enough that an elephant can swim in it. So perhaps, maybe your level, your approach to it is more like the infant that's just tasting the salt water of the ocean and saying, wow, this is the ocean. And this is amazing, and I'm just beginning to get my grips on it. Or maybe you feel like the elephant that's just almost drowning in it because it's so deep. That's the simplicity and the, is it profundity? It's profound. The gospel is very, very profound, and I invite you to come and read it and study it with us. But I need some more coffee. Maybe you disagree, but I think I do. if this helps, write this down. Romans, in general, can probably be broken down more or less into 4 large chunks. Count them 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And all of them, in some measure or another, relate to the gospel, as Paul is unpacking the gospel. And these are subsections and categories borrowed from Douglas Moo and Don Carson. And look at it this way. From chapter 1, verse 18 through chapter 4 is about the gospel and the righteousness of God by faith. Chapters 5 through 8 talks about the gospel as the power of God for salvation. Chapters 9 through 11 discuss the gospel and how it relates to Israel as the covenant people of God. And then chapters 12 through the end of 15 unpack the gospel and the transformed life, so that once we've got a grip on what the gospel is and what God has accomplished, the power of God and what it is that he's done, and because he's done that, we have the power and the ability to not just have a transformed life, but to live a transformed life. And how it makes a difference in your life and mine, and the lives of the people in Rome who are reading this. So I want you to hold on to that. But that's the big picture of Romans broken down into smaller chunks. But in just focusing on chapter 1, I want you to think about, remember, when we're approaching an epistle, we're asking, what's the problem? What's the solution? Chapters 1 through 3 of Romans goes at great length to explain, or to what extent, what the big problem is. And the problem in view is not just something that affects the church in Rome, but affects all of humanity as a whole. Let's read just the few verses. It says, "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse." So the scope of the problem is universal. That it's not just this example of godlessness and wickedness here, or this example of godlessness and wickedness here. It's everybody. So that the scope of the problem is one that touches all humans in all places at all times, since the beginning, since the creation of the world. So that the problem that Paul is addressing is cosmic in scope. And so that we have to be prepared to be thinking about the problem as being almost infinitely expansive and infinitely deep. One word about problem and solution. When you go to the doctor and the doctor gives you a checkup and examination, say, "Oh, my belly is achy, I've stubbed my toe, I've got these red marks, what do I do?" sort of thing. You go to the doctor because you're trusting that doctor has the capacity to be able to diagnose the problem well, so that because he can diagnose the problem well, he can prescribe well. He can offer the right treatment that's going to fix this, that's going to provide the right solution to your problem. So that once I have, say, a prescription that I'm taking to the pharmacy, I'm trusting that doctor knows the problem intimately enough so that he's going to give me something more than just a painkiller to make me feel good. That this prescription and these instructions are actually going to address the problem. Perhaps, many of us have had a problem with a doctor where you feel like whatever it is that they prescribed wasn't effective because for whatever reason, they gave you a faulty prescription because they gave you a faulty diagnosis, or that they didn't fully understand what your problem was, so that the medicine or the treatment really didn't do what it was intended to do. That's at least one example about the way in which, about the relationship between a diagnosis and a solution. What Paul is doing here is talking about the diagnosis, where he wants our eyes, along with the eyes of those in the ears of those in Romans, to really get a clear picture. How bad is this problem? Is sin just simply a slip up? Is it something that that is sort of an oopsie? Is it something that can be just remedied with a good deed a day, as many people come to think about their right relationship with God? For my money, I think that what you have in Romans, specifically Romans chapter 1, is among the most accurate diagnoses of the problem of a stranglehold that sin has on people like you and me because we're human. The problem that you and I deal with as regards to sin is so deep and so pervasive that it must have a divine solution. And the divine solution is unpacked through the rest of the book. But as you're reading through the rest of Romans 1, think about the nature of the problem. Think about what sin has done to corrupt our minds, to render them futile so that they don't work in the way that they're supposed to. Think about how in which it's described that God hands people over to their sinful desires to say, this is the sort of thing that you've desired and you've asked for it. I'll give it to you. Because not because that this sort of thing is good for you, but because this is the choice it is that you've made, and that because you've made these decisions, this is what makes you responsible for your actions, and that the righteousness of God is revealed in this way because you and I are responsible for the things that we've done, and that our sin is the sort of thing that brings upon God's wrath and his judgment, because God is a righteous God, because he's a God of justice who cannot let the guilty go unpunished, and that this is the state of human affairs as it is when we're separated from God by our sin. So again, as you're reading through Romans 1, take the time to catch the depth of the problem and the power of the stranglehold of sin on our lives. Because once we can see that, and see that fairly clearly, that's going to help us not only understand the nature of the problem as it relates to Jews who have the law in chapters 2 through 3, but also to get a picture about what it is that Paul means in chapter 3 when he says that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Take the time with Paul to diagnose the problem well, to see what is sin, how it affects our lives, and not just with regards to how it affects our lives in a horizontal dimension. That is, it affects my life and the life of a neighbor or a family member or a coworker, but how it affects our relationship with God in the vertical dimension. Meditate on that and get that picture clear in your mind, so that when Paul draws our attention to the gospel as the righteousness of God by faith, we're going to have a much clearer grasp as to what what is it that's so special, so unique about the gospel that you simply cannot find anywhere else in any other scheme of religion? Because the gospel is the sort of thing that makes Christianity, the work of Christ, and what walking as a Christian, being a Christian, walking in faith as a Christian, sets you apart from anybody else, for any other religion. So, thank you so much for walking with us into the Pauline epistles, as it may seem pretty self-evident right now. At some moments, I feel like the child waiting, and in other times, I feel like I'm the elephant who's floundering and can't find the bottom of this. If you haven't also subscribed, you can also find the links to our Facebook page, our website, opportunities to give, to help support this church plant in Whitley County. And I'm just thrilled that we have this freedom and opportunity together to learn and grow together, and to not just read God's word, not just to hear what it says, but also be doers. So I love you all very much, and I can hardly wait for the next time. Hopefully Monday, actually, we'll be maybe doing probably doing a video over chapters 2 through 3. So stay tuned for that, and I can't wait to see you next time.